The Morningside Institute brings scholars and students together to examine enduring ideas, create intellectual friendship, and enrich these ideas and friendships with the vibrant life of New York City. And to do this, we promote rigorous humanistic inquiry, cultivate each student's intellectual and moral development, and connect the questions and ideas that they bring to their classes and that we investigate in our programs with the city's many cultural opportunities. Now, most of this takes place in small dinner seminars between students and faculty in our office high in the tower of the Riverside Church up in Morningside Heights. But occasionally we saunter downtown to bring our work to other folks, especially folks who are outside the academic world. So we're delighted that you're here. If you enjoy this evening's lecture, you're not already on our mailing list, please visit our website. You can sign up for our email list. You can listen to podcasts of previous events. And we hope you'll join us again in the future. As we thought about what to discuss this evening, we kept thinking about how, as our society continues to fracture, a number of writers have argued that the liberal order inhabited by Republicans and Democrats alike has forgotten about working for the common good, and that our politics must more explicitly work for that good. But this isn't necessarily a new idea. Earlier in the 20th century, philosophers such as Jacques Maritain and Yves offered robust accounts of what the common good would look like in a pluralistic democracy. But frequently today, the invocations we hear of the common good dodge questions about pluralism, and they pass over these accounts or they reject them outright. So we wanted to step back and ask, were thinkers like Maritain naive? Do their accounts still offer us valuable insights, or were they better suited to a time that's now past? How can we genuinely promote the common good in a society with so much disagreement about what that good is? To answer this question, or to help us answer this question this evening, we have Ross Douthat, who really doesn't require much of an introduction to all of you, I imagine. Columnist at the New York Times, writer in residence at the Elm Institute, the author of books on everything from Harvard to Lyme disease. Those are merely bookends. There's no kind of equivalence in there. If there is, I'll let him make that. In my mind, the best way to capture Ross's work is to retell a joke I once heard from him, which is, what's the difference between David Brooks and Ross Douthat? David Brooks reminds the Times readers that they should be religious, and Ross Douthat reminds them why they're not. Now, we asked Ross to speak on the common good in a pluralistic society, but as he may explain in a moment, he's given this lecture the title Pluralism and Christian Power, a title that for some of you will be thrilling, and for others, perhaps a confirmation of that difference between him and David Brooks. We'll hear from Ross, leave some time for Q&A, and then, of course, leave ample time to enjoy refreshments afterward during our reception, which will conclude at 8:30. So thank you all for coming. Ross, welcome to Morningside.
Thank you, Nathaniel, for that incredibly kind introduction. And yes, I feel like, I don't want to say there's a touch of bait and switch in the lecture that I'm about to deliver, but if you've come hoping for a complete solution to the question of what is the common good and how we pursue it, you'll have to buttonhole me afterward over drinks, because I spent a certain amount of time diving deep into mid-century Christian literature, debates about the common good. And when I came up for air, I realized that I was, totally out of my depth. And so I would retreat a little bit to something that, as a journalist and newspaper columnist, I have a slightly better handle on, which is just raw power and how it's wielded in society. So there will be some discussion of the common good in this talk, but a resolution of the core question will await the next Morningside event, which you'll all have to attend. But I am going to talk a lot about Jacques Maritain. So why don't I begin? Again, thank you all for being here. So let's start with a big question. How should contemporary Christians in the United States and the Western world writ large react to the decline of their churches, the secularization of the culture, the final loss, potentially, of anything called Christendom. Perhaps one very important author has suggested they should reconcile themselves to this new dispensation, accepting that the modern age is not a sacral but a secular age, that the state can no longer be treated as the secular arm of the spiritual power, that the freedom of individual conscience is one of the crucial assets of our civilization. In this new order, any Christian approach to politics must accept the fact of pluralism, with its diverse spiritual lineages and its variety of moral creeds, and place its hope in the church's liberty, its opportunity to act as a spiritual leaven free from the corruptions of the past. But if this sounds like surrender to the spirit of the age, there is an alternative perspective. Christians might instead set out to build a new Christendom, a new Christianly inspired civilization. They might try to bring new life out of what remains of so-called cultural Christianity, the often unconscious Christian feelings and moral structures embodied in the history of the nations born out of the old Christendom. They might seek to turn the state away from a dangerous moral indifferentism, because the final objective of the law is to make men morally good, and toward a public recognition of God and biblical faith. Above all, they would reject the chimera of perfect moral and theological neutrality. For in reality, the world has done with neutrality. Willingly or unwillingly, states will be obligated to make a choice for or against the gospel. They will be shaped either by the totalitarian spirit or by the Christian spirit. I think in using these quotations, these descriptions, I sketch, to a reasonable approximation, one of the crucial debates among Christian intellectuals today, dividing not just conservatives from liberals, but conservatives against one another in a debate about how the Church of Jesus Christ should think about liberalism, secularism, the United States of America, modernity itself. But, and this is a terrible trick, and I'm sure it's not surprising at all, the reality is that all those quotations belong to the same writer. Indeed, not just to the same writer, but to the same writer in a single chapter of a single book, to Jacques Maritain, writing on church and state in the 6th chapter of his book, Man and the State, published in 1951. And the fact that I can construct such different, seemingly competing narratives from a single essay suggests that returning to Maritain's work might shed interesting light on our own controversies, almost 3 generations later. So in the chapter in question, Maritain was, rather famously, as part of a larger movement, trying to develop Catholic teaching on church-state relations beyond his church's traditional view that the two powers ideally should be effectively united, integrated as the soul and body are integrated in thought and operation. That older view implied that Catholicism should be recognized as the official religion of the state, that there should be some subordination of secular power to the hierarchical power of the church, and that the church should be able to rely on the secular power to enforce its own claims over all baptized Christians, making state power available, for instance, for the coercion or punishment of heretics and schismatics, some of you may be in this very audience, and to the maintenance of uniformity rather than pluralism in Christian practice and belief. The Catholic Church of Maritain's day, the post-World War II, pre-Vatican II church, was willing to accept that this kind of arrangement was often, maybe now increasingly always, a practical impossibility, but it was retained as an official ideal, a hoped-for destination even for a diverse and heavily Protestant republic like the United States. Whereas Maritain was arguing, with whatever care and caution and subtlety, for a more explicit shift, where the church would say that the ideal of church-state relations in the Middle Ages, the sacral Middle Ages, no longer applied in secular modernity, and that the ideal relationship was now a different one, from which there could be no return to, say, the political theology of the Spanish Inquisition. Now, whether or not Maritain was intellectually successful in arguing that this shift could happen without any change in formal doctrine, as an evolution rather than a rupture, in practice, he and others did succeed in changing the public posture of the Catholic Church. Within a generation, to the extent that the older teaching still persisted, it did so as a hidden aspect, a traditionalist secret wrapped inside very modern-sounding rhetoric. Thus, even scholars like Thomas Pink, who argue that the Second Vatican Council actually retained the prior teaching, some kind of integralist ideal, even those arguments tend to rely on close reading and careful parsing, while conceding that in terms of Catholicism's self-presentation, its official theology, as distinct maybe from inerrant magisterial theology, Maritain's ideas carried all before them. But they did so, crucially, because they promised something more than simple church-state separation, and certainly something more than a reconciliation with liberalism in its most secularizing aspect. The apparent dualities and internal tensions of Maritain's essay reflect this key aspect of his argument, that in setting aside any formal claim to political power or establishment, in laying down the tiara, the Church of Christ could not just retain influence, but aspire to a kind of soft hegemony, a power within a pluralist context that would be exercised more indirectly, but remain real power all the same. Real enough, indeed, to merit the old label Christendom, however different its modern aspects. This power would flow, first and foremost, from what Maritain called vivifying inspiration. The Church, separated from the state, freed of certain corruptions and temptations, would be more radiant, with a penetrating and vivifying influence on other agents whose place is less high in the scale of being. But that influence, crucially, would not just be felt in the individual conscience. Maritain's other agents pretty clearly include various secular forms of power, the powers of lawmaking and culture shaping, which would be expected to be still, in some sense, on the side of the gospel, never imposing all its doctrines, but still animated by its teachings, still seeking a Christian politics amid a landscape of theological pluralism. So if from the vantage point of 1951, Maritain was a liberalizer, from the vantage point of 2022, he can sound more like one of the fearsome post-liberals. His vision rules out coercion in belief, but clearly allows, within the limits of prudence, for all manner of morals legislation, Sabbatarian laws, bans on pornography, prayer in schools, and more. It requires religious toleration and church-state separation, but then doesn't expect that every religious body will enjoy equal influence or equal deference. It expects the state to accommodate human weakness, but also to seek moral improvement, not simply leaving individuals to their libertarian devices. And if, in theory, this vision of the Christian society can seem a little vague and abstract, as well as maybe idealistic and over-optimistic, if the two impulses that I counterpose to one another at the outset aren't always perfectly harmonized, still Maritain could claim that his vision had a hard-headed and practical basis in the real world. Because with whatever theological baggage, he felt he was essentially describing something like the American model of church-state relations, of Christian politics playing out in a pluralist society, albeit reimagined somewhat in his specific argument for a society with a Catholic majority rather than a Protestant one. So the proper exercise of Christian power under modern conditions was not visible only in some theoretical utopia. It was already clear enough in the role that Protestant churches, eventually joined by the Catholic Church, had played in this country for generations. Here, Christian belief was not imposed, nor any specific denomination privileged, but nonetheless, America was clearly a Christian society, more Christian in practice than many European countries with established churches. And the power of the faith was manifest in the shaping role that Christian ideas played in so many prominent institutions, so many political and cultural debates. Thus, without ever demanding creedal conformity, let alone licensing and inquisition, Christian America was constantly debating the proper application of biblical principle and natural law to secular politics, constantly generating religious reform movements with a social or economic vision of, yes, the common good. And that long experience, from abolition to the temperance movement, the social gospel, to the Christian influence on the New Deal, with revivalism, a constant throughout, demonstrated the fundamental plausibility of the Maritanian vision. The church and state could disentangle without disentangling Christianity from politics, without undermining Christian faith, without even abandoning some idea of Christendom itself. So that was 1951. And today we know, or at least a lot of people feel, that such optimism was time-bound and ill-fated. The religious arrangements that Maritain observed in America, the mix of church-state separation and soft Protestant hegemony, dissolved across the generation following his essay. And the religious conservatism that then sought to restore some kind of American Christendom via an evangelical Catholic alliance was effectively defeated in its turn. In Europe, a Maritainian model arguably flourished in the brief window of his lifetime, the Christian democratic golden age of Adenauer and de Gaulle, and then similarly dissolved into outright de-Christianization, with any alternative confined to the continent's peripheries. This unhappy experience has generated various critiques of Maritain's vision among writers sifting through the wreckage of Western Christianity, trying to figure out where everything went wrong. And it should be noted that many of them follow in Maritain's own footsteps, since by the time of The Peasant of the Garonne, his late life, mid-1960s cry of disillusionment, he was convinced that his own hope for an advent of a Christian politics had been completely frustrated, and casting about for more radical alternatives on the left and the right, from his friend Saul Alinsky to the Chilean Christian Democrat Eduardo Frei. So Maritain was on board with the idea that things had not gone according to plan. But so what were these critiques? Well, first, there is a fairly famous philosophical critique from Maritain's own time, indebted to Thomas de Koninck, that suggests that Maritain's philosophical personalism was a wrong turn, that his vision of the common good was too fundamentally individualistic, too easily turned, despite its claims to be communitarian, to functionally libertarian ends, opening the door in turn for a kind of return of totalitarianism. This is a very interesting argument, and it represents some of those deep waters that Nathaniel encouraged me to dive into. But it's also highly technical, deeply frustrating, and to me raises the question, could the decline of European and American Christianity really have been foreordained by a debate that only about 6 people seem to be able to completely follow? And I want to concede that possibly so. But for the sake of the rest of us, the journalists especially, the rest of this talk will follow what I think is the more legible and straightforward political critique of Maritain, which suggests basically that he was too naive about what would follow sooner or later, sooner in this case, from the church's surrender of formal political power. Whatever soft power the faith retained, whatever vivifying influence, the terms of that surrender still fundamentally left Christianity at the mercy of the state. And as Thomas Pink puts it in one of the more direct critiques of the church and state chapter, since the 1950s, political secularization has not taken the benign form that Maritain predicted. Instead, rather than, as he hoped, a clearer distinction between the temporal and the sacred, a clearer sense of the church's superiority to the grubby political realm, today we have a secular state imposing itself ever more disrespectfully on Christianity, constantly demanding things of the church, disregarding the limits on secular power that Maritain and later the authorities of the Second Vatican Council both seem to assume would hold. And the lesson then, especially for writers sympathetic to the older style of integralism that Maritain was criticizing, the lesson might be that a regime that does not explicitly use its powers in favor of the true faith will eventually end up using its powers against that faith. And that if you give up direct control over the state, you will eventually earn its enmity. Out of this critique, you can tell a story about Christianity's specifically American decline, in which the secular state becomes the key player. The soft hegemony of American Protestantism in this account didn't simply fail from the 1950s onward, rather it was torn down from above, using raw political power, beginning with the Supreme Court decisions on school prayer and continuing through Roe v. Wade to Obergefell versus Hodges, with other social and economic coups and revolutions from above folded in as well. The soft Christian power that Maritain observed and celebrated in this account was no match for the hard power of liberal and later neoliberal elites. And the specific kind of political secularity that he defended was always destined to give way to something different, less benign and Christian influenced, more aggressive and domineering and intolerant. And this last point represents the critique of Maritain at its strongest, since I think it's impossible to read some of his work today without occasionally picking up the same over-optimistic vibe that informed so much religious writing between, let's say, World War II and 1968. The kind of Harvey Coxian feeling that you're listening to a confident mid-century urban planner sell you an apartment in Brasilia. And that looked dated to Maritain himself, as we've seen 15 years later, let alone to us today. But with that concession to his over-optimism, his Coxian vibe, one might make two arguments in defense of Maritain's general perspective. The first would directly challenge the claim that the primary force driving American Christianity's retreat has actually been the power of a secular and anti-Christian state. Yes, state power has mattered to religious change. Yes, culture can be downstream of politics, but in a fashion that's more often provisional than decisive, and still frequently subordinate not just to general social and cultural trends, but more importantly to developments and crises within the Christian church itself. Thus, the school prayer decisions, for instance, did clearly strike a blow against soft Protestant hegemony. But judicial hostility to public expressions of Christianity really peaked in the 1960s and early 1970s and has been partially rolled back by justices friendlier to religious liberty and religious expression in the decades since. The crucial Supreme Court decisions on homosexuality and same-sex marriage clearly followed broad shifts in public opinion rather than preceding them, ratifying a cultural revolution rather than imposing one. The recent use of civil rights law to harass conservative Christians is just that, a recent development made possible by prior institutional change and cultural weakness, not some immediate and inexorable consequence of laws passed to a very different purpose almost 60 years ago. And while the Supreme Court's Roe v. Wade decision on abortion did impose a revolutionary dictum, given that the pro-life movement is pretty much the only element of religious conservatism that's actually gained some ground since the 1970s, it's hard to argue that Roe v. Wade explains secularization, the decline of religious identification, or the cultural weakness of the churches. Instead, the more important explanation lies within, in Christianity's internal divisions, its failure to respond effectively to social and economic and technological changes, its theological civil wars and failures of leadership and egregious scandals. No ruthless secular authority drove the Protestant mainline to collapse. The crisis of faith among the mainline's own leaders, the bishops and theologians who denied core Christian doctrines, the desperate chasing after certain political causes to make up for the waning of missionary zeal, even the tendency, long predating the 1960s, for upper middle class Presbyterians and Lutherans and Methodists to have ever fewer children. All these mattered far more than anything the Warren Court or later neoliberalism did. Likewise, it's hard to see how a Supreme Court decision outlawing school prayer in public schools led to the swift post-1960s decline of Catholic infrastructure in America, an infrastructure which had, after all, been forged precisely as an alternative to soft Protestantism in public schools, and which had flourished during a period of much greater anti-Catholic impositions than anything the secular state brought to bear in the 60s or 70s. Nevertheless, it was those years, rather than the 1870s, that were the decades of Catholic crisis and partial collapse. Again, not because of external political pressure, but because of terrible internal divisions over how to adapt or not to the social trends and changes of the era. Post-Vatican II Catholicism divided over liturgy, theology, morality, and finally politics. And then its partial recovery of unity, at times at least in the John Paul II era, was undermined by the horrors of the sex abuse crisis. Would the church have avoided all of this if Griswold v. Connecticut had been decided differently? Surely not. The breaking of pre-conciliar Catholicism in the post-conciliar era was something that Catholics did themselves. So it shouldn't be surprising then that Maritain's formula for a gentle Christian hegemony failed in an era when so many Christians lost faith in their own doctrines, when the church is divided over what were and weren't essential teachings, and when the salt lost its savor in so many conspicuously scandalous ways. His formula for a kind of Christian power under pluralism doesn't require Christian perfection. Nobody would call America's 19th century Protestant establishment perfect or saintly always. But it does require some degree of doctrinal confidence, some reasonable fit between ecclesiastical structures and social trends, and some clear sense of missionary zeal. And the fact that his model of Christian politics failed across an era when Catholics were feuding fiercely over their own liturgy, when mainline Protestantism lost faith in the resurrection and the virgin birth, and when evangelicalism's leadership regressed from Billy Graham to Jerry Falwell Jr., might indict the era's Christians more than it indicts his model of how a Christian society ought to work. Especially since, in the same period, there wasn't really a countervailing example of how a closer relationship between church and state could have saved Christian power from eclipse. Quite the reverse. While the American model of power amid pluralism did not prevent Christianity's decline, the ebb of faith and Christian influence was still less complete in the United States than in societies that modeled a more integrated church-state relationship prior to the 1960s. The self-consciously hard-headed, maybe faintly grand inquisitorial idea that the church can survive scandal, social change, and theological crisis through the raw exercise of power may be true in certain historical cases, but it finds no vindicating example in recent modern history. Instead, just in Catholic examples, the stronger church-state integration in, say, Quebec or Spain or Ireland proved a paper tiger rather than a firm Platonic guardian, and simply collapsed when it came to the test. And meanwhile, and here we come to the second point that might be made in defense of the Maritain hypothesis, his vision of religious power amid pluralism, that model actually arguably continued to function quite impressively in post-1960s America. It's just that a somewhat different religion filled the place heretofore occupied by Judeo-Christian values, Protestant, Catholic, Jew, mainline Christianity, whatever you want to call the soft consensus of the past, seizing its own kind of soft hegemony, filling the space left by the crack up of the mainline and the differing failures of Catholicism and evangelicalism. The American public square did not, in this reading of history, become simply naked as Christian influence receded. Instead, a religious tendency that had been subordinate throughout American history, potent but not hegemonic, took over the role that Maritain envisioned for his own church and Christianity as a whole. This tendency can carry many, many labels, but for this talk's purposes, we'll call it post-Protestant Gnosticism, descended along different lines from early American deism, transcendentalism, various health and wealth enthusiasms, and manifest in the therapeutic forms of spirituality that were captured at the moment of their ascent to power by writers like Philip Rieff and Robert Belloc, and that now operate in American life in roughly the same way and with very roughly the same sort of influence as mainline Protestantism 100 years ago. Lacking firm doctrinal definitions and ecclesiastical hierarchies, and including among its ranks a real mixture of formal commitments, secular, spiritual, semi-Christian, this new religion's churchliness was not immediately evident, which is one reason that Christians, again, in the 60s and 70s, were more often worried about raw atheism than the faith that was actually taking over their position in the culture. But over time, the label that's applied by internet reactionaries to this post-Christian formation, the cathedral, has become more and more appropriate. Like the old religious establishment, the ascendant Gnosticism operates through a set of institutions that resemble an ecclesia, both the old institutions of Protestant Christianity, its universities especially, and also more novel institutional powers, from the complex tangle of big foundations and philanthropies and activist outfits to the church of the masses manifest in media and television and now Silicon Valley. Like the old Christian establishment, this new hegemon experiences periods of revival and inner turmoil. The new age of the 70s was formative in the same way that the George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards era was formative for early Republic Protestantism. And the current Great Awakening resembles the 19th century awakenings in its effort to renew and reshape the various institutions of this church. And like those past, like the Christian hegemony of the past, the ascendant Gnosticism influences society in something much closer to Maritain's model than to a stricter form of integralism. It wields its power primarily through the cultural influence of non-political institutions, and only secondarily through direct lawmaking or rulemaking. Its rule is firm within its own institutional territory, but more limited and moderated in the political sphere writ large. And where it directly shapes the interpretation of laws, it often does so through vivifying inspiration rather than ecclesial imposition. A certain style of Gnostic values, you could say, pervade the key rulings of a figure like Anthony Kennedy, without there having been some explicit Gnostic religious edict that Kennedy was bound to follow. And there has been no central committee of wokeness, no progressive holy office driving the rolling reinterpretations of the Civil Rights Act. At the same time, the new hegemon is tolerant of religious difference, allowing conservative forms of Christianity to persist, even unto this lecture in the heart of Manhattan, in the same way that the old Christian establishment allowed America's various forms of religious diversity and Christian heresy to flourish. It just sets certain limits, or aspires to set certain limits on their freedoms, establishes some implicit cultural hierarchies, and generally tries to nudge other faiths towards itself, especially on certain key issues. The various attempts to push Christian churches towards a reconciliation with the sexual revolution, for instance, doesn't really resemble Reformation-era repression of religious dissent, but it does somewhat represent the constant pressure experienced by Mormonism or Christian Science or even Catholicism in our more Protestant past, when the issue wasn't doctrine writ large or even some specific practice or idea that fell just a little bit too far outside the moral and cultural consensus. Keep your faith, but consider making it a little more like ours, is the constant message from the hegemon, with the further promise that if you converge with the hegemon, you might get to share some of its cultural power, rather than remaining perpetually outside the cathedral's doors. Now, of course, the pressure on non-Protestants in the 19th century wasn't always gentle. And some critics of the new hegemon argue that its own relative tolerance is just a temporary stage, that already in speech codes and cancellations, you can see an incipient totalitarianism, a more censorious and inquisitorial future, with even overt persecution waiting in the wings. And these critics are certainly correct that the new religious hegemon has become more intolerant as its power in certain core institutions has increased. But I think it's still very much an open question whether that intolerance will lead inexorably to greater power over the entire culture, or whether in a society as diverse and complex as ours, the zeal of a hegemon has a self-limiting effect, generating stronger backlash when it uses power too overtly, creating new centers of resistance when it imposes theological conformity too explicitly, and imposing a Brezhnevian or if you prefer, late 19th century Bostonian frieze that looks solid but can't survive the heat of crisis. Whereas the more relaxed kind of Gnostic hegemony, a more Maritanian form, think early Obama era progressivism, not peak Great Awakening progressivism, might have more staying power, disarming opposition, preempting backlash, balancing its power and its society's pluralism sustainably, rather than risking a crack up for the sake of inquisitorial control. At the very least, we can observe that the more intense form of the new religion is meeting resistance all over right now, even unto San Francisco's school boards. And just as the most stringent expressions of Protestant hegemony in the old America sometimes found themselves resented and rolled back, with prohibition being a conspicuous example, so our Gnostic church could remain culturally established for another generation, but find that its militants and missionaries are forced back to gentler tactics for a time. So from this admittedly highly debatable interpretation of ideas in recent histories, I want to draw a few very provisional conclusions. First, for the sake of these debates happening within Christianity, among Christian intellectuals, there's important and interesting common ground between Maritain's attempt to reconcile Catholic teaching with religious liberty and pluralism, and the current post-liberal attempt to distinguish a Christian political vision from so-called classical liberalism or libertarianism. The Maritainian and contemporary post-liberal visions both imagine a society shaped in profound ways by religious power. They both expect the law to be a moral teacher and the state to seek the common good. And they share an implicit critique of classical liberalism in its purest form as fatally naive, its goal of strict religious neutrality a functional impossibility. Because even under conditions of pluralism, religion and politics will never be separated. Some religions will always shape laws and cultural norms more than others. A religion that wins converts, which obviously Christianity aspires to do, will inevitably end up wielding increased political power as well. And if you throw down one religious hegemon, a new spiritual power will fill that void soon enough. So if this shared view, this Maritainian post-liberal overlap is correct, then it might imply that some of the running debates about Christianity's relationship to, say, the American founding, the place of ancient religion within modern liberalism, are putting a little too much weight on what we might suppose in theory, and not enough on what we've already seen in practice. Whatever the founding generation of this country intended, or whatever the implicit philosophical implications of some of their arguments implied, 1776 and 1789 created a political order, call it a liberal political order, that has been compatible with multiple different forms of soft religious hegemony. And you can, subdivide our history in different ways. You could say there was a brief Unitarian era, a long Protestant ascendancy, a shorter Protestant Catholic and Judeo-Christian era, and finally our own period of Gnostic power. But however you subdivide it, each of those forms has been potent and influential. Each has been somewhat contested and contingent. And that means that for anyone discontented with our current state of affairs, our current hegemon, the record of American history offers license for all kinds of aspirations, including a vision of a renewed American Christendom that both Maritain and the post-liberals share. But then where Maritain diverged clearly from the old integralism and seems to diverge in certain ways from some forms of post-liberalism as well, on questions of how closely should church and state be aligned, how tolerant of pluralism should this imagined renewed Christendom be, whether Christian renewal can be imposed from above, or whether it must begin as an organic and voluntary process. How much can be accomplished religiously and culturally if your primary weapons are political? On those questions, I think the record of the last 70 years has continued to supply evidence in Maritain's favor. So that evidence in a short list that, again, that Christianity's decline was driven more by an internal crisis of faith than by political pressure from above or without, that closer to integralist solutions to the crisis failed more completely than the Maritainian model, that the Gnostic successor to Protestant hegemony achieved its own religious ascendancy in roughly or even precisely the way that Maritain imagined religious power being wielded effectively within pluralism, and that this Gnosticism's hold on power today is more contested and vulnerable to backlash the more fully integralist it seeks to become. And then a final, not really throwaway piece of evidence that even the contemporary models invoked by post-liberals for how a Christian revival might be encouraged from above, most of them Eastern European, and touching on subjects that should be in all of our thoughts these days, in fact, have not clearly generated an alternative Christendom that's as vital in practice as American Christianity remains even now, as the weaker religious power under pluralism after decades of cultural defeat. Just to be super specific, I'm talking about, let's say, current trends in Hungarian and Polish church attendance. At some point, the political embrace of cultural Christianity may revivify practicing Christianity, but it hasn't obviously happened yet. So all this suggests, on the one hand, that American Christians interested in the recovery of lost influence can and should go some distance with the critique of classical liberalism, recognizing that the perfectly religiously neutral society does not exist, that to preach the gospel is to inevitably seek some kind of Christendom, and that what Christians see in today's progressive cathedral isn't just an imitation of how their own faith once wielded power within pluralism, but in its milder forms, also a model for how it might someday do so again. But with all that, on the other hand, it also suggests the importance of recognizing the moral and spiritual advantages of putting limits on faith's temporal ambitions and trying to wield power within pluralism rather than over and against it. Unlike Maritain, I don't want to make any incredibly strong claims about the ideal church-state relationship under ideal social conditions, not least because I think official and magisterial Catholic teaching at the moment are more unsettled in many ways than they were in his own time. And also because I don't think those ideal arguments are useful or necessary in cases where the practical realities seem so clear. And I think for those to hear, these are the practical lessons of the recent Christian past and our own country's history. Religious power wielded wisely and mildly and indirectly, with due respect to liberty and diversity, and a focus first on the faith's internal health and zeal, can potentially sustain religious power, a religious ascendancy for many generations. But religious power wielded too much against pluralism, with political ambition substituting for real faithfulness, is likely to corrupt and enervate and bring about its own reward. So, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ross. We have a number of students here. I'm going to give them priority in the Q&A. So if you're a student or if you think you can pass as
we
one,
all students of life?
if you're a student under a university, not just a student of life, I'm going to give you first priority in questions. I'm going to Ross field the questions. We have about 20 minutes, and my colleague John Luke has a microphone. He'll come over to you. If you can just introduce yourself as you ask your question. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Amo, student at Columbia. So I had a question about pluralism. I'm not really sure what it is. The sort of more serious gloss on the question is that you set your talk up as a defense of Maritain, right? A defense of the idea that a plausible theological politics should, be guided by the aim of adapting itself to a pluralistic society. But it feels like the moral of a bunch of the sociological observations that you made is that the notion of pluralism actually doesn't really have as much sociological purchase as like liberal thinkers think it does, right? Because as you point out, that like supposedly a religious secular society has like all kinds of strands of religion built into it and so on. But the way Maritain sets the problem up, right, is, you know, taking the idea of a pluralistic society for granted. It feels like one of the morals of your talk is that we shouldn't do that. The notion of pluralism and of, you know, and of the a-religious character of social life, or the diffusely religious character of social life, actually requires a little bit more scrutiny, right? Because where some people say a-religiosity, you see heterodox religion, right? So
yes. So I think, well, I think that's right, but I think it's in my, you know, highly provisional reading, I think that is there in Maritain too. And that, you know, it is, I meant what I said, that I don't think the tension that I used to frame the essay is perfectly reconciled in his piece. And it's, you know, I don't think it's perfectly reconciled in my analysis either. But it seems like two things can be true. One is that, you know, modern conditions seem radically pluralistic when you contrast them to, you know, a lot of to super generalized pre-modern and traditional societies, right? There is extreme diversity of beliefs and attitudes and commitments, and that's sort of a, you know, a fundamental reality that, to the extent anything has sort of resolved it, it's only done so through totalitarian methods, and then not successfully anyway. Although that's itself an open question. So that's true, but then it's also true that in those pluralist societies, some ideas are more important than others, and some institutions are more important than others, right? And, you know, I'm describing the sort of dominant ideas and institutions of our time as explicitly religious deals some bases. You know, I think it's certainly the question of what is a religion is highly contestable, and, you know, is you know, what I'm calling Gnosticism really a religion in the sense that Christianity is religion, et cetera, right? Those are very reasonable questions. But if you keep it just in the realm of idea, you know, if you say we're talking about categories that can encompass ideology as well as theology, or, you know, and so on, I think there in Maritain's argument from the beginning, if you go through the essay, is the sense that, like, yeah, there's, you know, you're going to have religious toleration, you're going to have a lot of religious diversity, but you're going to have a central faith in the society. You're going to have some faiths that are closer to that central faith and exert more influence because of their closeness to it, and some others that are further away. And you're going to have, you know, you're going to have some faiths that are beyond the limits of pluralism, which is something, you know, everybody tacitly accepts, right? With disagreement about where the lines are. And you're going to have some effective, you know, in the place where the central faith and the faiths closest to the central faith have a kind of moral consensus, you are going to have some vision of the common good that expresses itself in law and culture. I think that's right. And I think it is useful as, yeah, I mean, one, obviously, this is not something that's incompatible with a classical liberal framework, but the initial commitments of classical liberalism and the arguments that classical liberals tend to make against, you know, both in our own debates, the woke left and the post-liberal right, tend to foreground the idea of neutrality. And I think it's worth foregrounding for our purposes the inevitable limits of that neutrality, not least because it offers these contending groups something to aspire towards, right? Like, yes, you know, if you win a debate, you do get to have a lot more influence over society. It's not, you know, the United States historically has not just been a sort of perpetual debating society where everybody, you know, sort of has interesting debates and then returns to their community and nothing changes. The results of debates have big implications for law and politics and culture. And that, in turn, for when you've lost a series of debates, right, as Christians have, that is itself a form of, it holds out a kind of hope, right? A sense that like, okay, for these various reasons you lost these debates, but you don't have to go all the way to, to the idea of exerting direct political power to imagine yourself wielding, some version of the power that you're on the receiving end of now, which is sort of a, maybe not the most Christian of impulses to carry into politics, but it's clearly one that is in the minds of a lot of religious conservatives today.
Sorry, I'm Todd. I'm a medical student at Columbia. One question that I had was, well, I guess I'll start with kind of the post-liberals would say that it's actually no accident that this specific religion,
right,
wokeism, has arisen in its particular form. It's always has maybe little different flavors across the years, but one of the big post-liberal accounts of it is that it sees itself as progressivism, and as in sort of the Marcuse line of thinking, sees itself specifically as the heir to the liberal tradition in which our politics have been designed for 250 years. I guess my question is, given that has been the religion that has finally taken over, how do you see it as possible that perhaps another religion could become predominant if it doesn't specifically see itself as the fulfillment of the political arrangement that America is, has been in for the past 250 years?
I mean, I think there is a very strong and plausible argument there, right? That says, okay, at some point, this is sort of, I mean, the way I'd frame it is American society is intensely individualistic, right? Relative to many other societies in human history. And at a certain point, that individualism demands a more individualist religion. Sort of the core elements of Gnosticism that you see in our own era, kind of God within spirituality, sort of this are highly oriented towards American individualism. If you go and look at, the crucial texts of the 70s or our own era, the sort of Oprah style and spirituality, right? It's all sort of key to this sense of individualism. And so, yeah, it's this sort of organic unfolding process, and you have to cut away the political root in this kind of individualistic style of politics. That's possible. On the other hand, right, like one, it's not clear to me where, for instance, the current revolution within Gnosticism ends up, right? Like certain elements, like if you just look at what we call the awakening now, right? Certain elements of it sort of seem to further that individualism. It's like, well, of course, liberalism is going to go from same-sex marriage to transgenderism to as many genders as there are people, right? Like that's obviously liberalism working itself out. You need to cut away the liberal taproot. What's happening with race and sex is a little different, right? It's more oriented towards group identity. It's more oriented, I think, in certain ways, back towards ideas of the common good. There's, I think, very clearly an attempt to impose not a Christian sexual ethic, but an actual sexual ethic on the kind of hyper-individualism that I like to call Hefnerism, right? Like Hefnerism, when Hugh Hefner died, I wrote the nastiest piece I've ever written at the Times, and which was very popular, which tells you something about the internet, about him. And I felt like I was, one of a minority of people writing attacks on Hugh Hefner after he died. Most of the pieces were like, this guy, civil liberties, freedom, the 60s, it's awesome. That was 2 months before the Harvey Weinstein stuff broke. Today, Hugh Hefner, I'm not going to say he's been canceled. He's kind of been canceled, right? Like, and Hefnerism is not where woke progressivism is going. It's going somewhere different, right? So if you can have these, and with race, it's a little more complicated, but there's similar dynamics. So if you can have these kind of communitarian rebellions within the Gnostic heresy itself, I think that tells you that things are a little more fluid and flexible than these kind of like liberalism leads to progressivism, leads to Gnosticism, got to cut away the root would lead you to think, right? I mean, a different way to think about it is that America has always contained within itself a lot of different tendencies, and you go through highly individualistic periods and more communitarian periods, and there's cycles and ebbs and flows, and religious awakenings play key roles in these eras. And for a set of, somewhat contingent reasons having to do with technological changes, economic changes, in the role of women, invention of the birth control pill, later the invention of the internet, all these things, Christianity didn't adapt to that post-60s era, and it created an opening for a different kind of cult to sort of ride that wave. But this wave is still there. You're still getting more individualistic forms and then more communitarian reactions, which, it just suggests to me that it's not this sort of absolute progression from, John Locke to where we are, and you got to go back and kill Locke. Yeah, again, time machine, kill John Locke, right? I don't think that's right. And then the other point, I mean, I also don't want to minimize the challenge faced by Christianity. I mean, I think the core issue here is, there's a those changes. I don't know what the right Christian adaptation is to those changes, right? I don't have a 5-point plan for how the churches should deal with the sexual revolution meets the iPhone. I have ideas, but people have obviously been trying to adapt, and it's not like we keep coming back to these same debates within the Christian churches because they're really hard problems of adaptation where it's a big challenge. I'm skeptical that Locke makes it impossible, and I'm also skeptical that America is completely unique in being, is this the only time and place when the Gnostic heresy could possibly have triumphed because of our rampant individualism? My understanding, the other critique of Gnosticism is that it's the eternal heresy of Christianity. And, if it hadn't been for St. Dominic, it would have taken over medieval Europe, which was definitely not a hyper-individualistic, internet-mediated society, right? Or had things shaken out a little bit differently in the 4th century, right? Or, maybe more the 3rd or 2nd century. But either way, in very different times and places, Gnosticism has emerged as a kind of symbiote / rival to Christianity. And that too, I think, should make us skeptical of a kind of absolutism about, the sort of the liberal order's effects on people's theological and spiritual beliefs. But I don't dispute that for at least contingent reasons, American liberalism has been, a sort of a potent incubator of this kind of spirituality. That is obviously true. I think that.
Mine's a shorter one. It's actually picking up on a point that you just raised.
Sorry. I'm sorry.
Fletcher also picking up on a point you just raised. I actually just was reading Acts recently, and soft power within a pluralistic society might be a way to describe the early church. So I was wondering if there are cycles. It seemed like you were touching on a few. I was wondering if you could sketch what those cycles look like in medieval Europe, because I have a hard time accepting that it's been a hegemon in the way that you might glibly describe it through Europe for 2,000 years. So I'm wondering if you could give more details on that example you just raised.
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to, bring in a true historian rather than a journalist. But I mean, I think the early church represents sort of the sort of extreme case, right, where it's obviously starting from almost nothing and is the faith of the empire by the end. And then you have, but that story is itself, I think, sort of an account that shows the complexity of these questions, right? Because you can look at that story and say, well, Christianity wouldn't have actually become the religion of the empire if Constantine hadn't basically imposed it, right? Like there's a story about that whole cycle that fits with the more sort of, it places politics closer to the center. But then it's also contestable, right? Where you say, well, one, Constantine would never have considered becoming a Christian had there not been this remarkable influence within the pluralism of the empire that can't be explained by the use of state power. And two, if you read, what's the book that everybody reads and analogizes to the rise of wokeness? The final pagan generation, right? Everyone here has obviously read this book. That account, it's like, all right, well, Constantine and his successors did sort of impose Christianity, and there was sort of some, closures of temples and some persecution. But for the most part, the pagan life of the empire went on. And even there, the reason Christians won over the course of the 4th century and 5th century, while, by the way, fighting with each other about doctrine every chance they get, was its own version of this sort of, they had more intensity and more seriousness, and they did continue to use soft power as well as harder power. So those would be some of the complexities, I guess, just in that wave. The modern era is obviously distinct, right? And this is where sort of the more technology enters the story, the harder it gets to sort of analogize perfectly to pre-modern conditions. But yeah, you could sort of continue the story and say, whatever Constantine did, the Roman Empire fell apart, and the Christianity of the Dark Ages wasn't really within plural. That's not the right way to think about the Dark Ages exactly, right? It's not exactly pluralism when the Vikings are burning your village, but it is, it was sort of a dispersed pluralism where you would get radically different beliefs if you got on a ship and sailed a little ways away. And there's certainly, even once Charlemagne comes on the scene, it's a long time before you have sort of centralized impositions. So yeah, there are ways in which, any period before you get to modern state building, even with formal Christian power, effectively Christianity is still operating, I think, in some version of Maritain's way. And we're sort of, the period that is sort of associated with with peak integralism, if you will, is not 2,000 years of Christian history. It's, maybe 12th century to the Wars of the Reformation, plus some sort of discrete periods previously. But then, the integralists would stand up and say, well, what about when Clovis converted? That was how we got France, right? So it's complicated, and you need a real historian.
We will take one more question.
You mentioned very often, obviously, the trade-off that occurs, this balancing act between these values being enforced, whether hard or soft power analogy that I like, versus pluralism. But it seems to me like the larger trade-off is liberty, right, more broadly, because that's where we see more attention to the expedited enforcement of said values or not. And this is like the age-old question for any integralist, I assume. But when we're doing such a delicate balancing act between all these different ideas, what role does liberty have in this vision of the common good that you have, and where's this, and what principled line do you draw when it comes to maintaining liberties as a good in itself or for a higher end, and what role does liberty play overall in such a system?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and there is a long section actually of the Maritain chapter that's more focused on that to some extent. And I think my reading of there's sort of two, right? There's sort of two issues, right? One, he is himself picking up on the, what you might call the sort of proto-liberal strand in Christian thinking throughout, right? Which is the idea that, you are not actually supposed to coerce belief, right? And that sort of the coercion of the non-believer is in some sense unchristian, which is not a specifically modern idea. It's an important Christian idea from the start. It's just you get the complexity that enters in with the question of the church's authority over the baptized, and that's the theoretical complexity. And then the practical complexity is you may say, we're not gonna coerce our Jewish neighbors or our Muslim neighbors, but in practice, obviously, pre-modern Christianity ended up, attempting to do exactly that. And I don't think Maritain resolves those complexities, but his argument is that you are effectively, the church has not sufficiently erred on the side of liberty and needs to err more on the side of liberty, with the sort of corollary that that I think is correct, right, which is about separate from liberty of belief, liberty of behavior, right, where he follows Aquinas in saying that not all forms of sin and wickedness should be prevented by state power. And which forms of sin and wickedness should be prevented by state power? Well, that's a prudential question, which is a huge cop-out, but in fact is actually correct, right? And it's so I'm just this is sort of now just my own personal thinking on something particular to America. But it's, I think, a fine place to end. I wrote a column a couple weeks ago after the Super Bowl about the spread of gambling in the United States, right? And what should the law do about gambling? Should it stamp it out entirely? Should it allow it generally? I don't think there's any perfect answer to that question, and any line you draw about the regulation of gambling is going to seem arbitrary. And but in the column, I basically made a defense of the totally arbitrary system that I grew up with, where, you could do casino gambling in Atlantic City and Las Vegas, and then on some Native American reservations. Was there any consistent principle at work in that system? Of course not. It was historically contingent, rested on, Bugsy Siegel's adventures in the Nevada desert and the cleverness of, tribal leaders and their lawyers. But I think it would have been a really good prudential resting point for American law and custom on gambling. And this maybe is some aspect of American character that's connected to our liberalism or something specifically American. But I think Americans really don't like that kind of this is, it's arbitrary, right? Something connected to the idea of rights, which is something we haven't touched at all on in this discussion. So I'm just throwing it out there at the end, right? But something about founding your political system on rights does maybe seem to push people away from a certain kind of prudential balancing of liberty and morality, and towards, once a liberty is conceded, it has to be demanded full spectrum. If you can gamble in New Jersey, you have to be able to gamble in Connecticut. If you can bet on the Super Bowl here, you have to be able to do it there. And I do think that's a challenge and a problem in our national life that, maybe is connected to certain inherent political tendencies of our regime. So on that point, conceding important ground to the integralists, I guess I'll stop.